the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello everybody, we're on the road today in London town at the august offices of the Financial Times, actually the palatial offices of the Financial Times, my favorite international economics newspaper, in fact my favorite international newspaper generally. And one of the things I love about what the FT does is their Business Book of the Year prize. My old friend Andrew Hill has been on the show a couple of times before, and he is the convener, the man who makes the trains run on time when it comes to the FT Book Prize. Andrew, it's in its 20th year?
20th edition this year, yes. We started it in 2005 and still going.
Is there one book you think that captures the spirit of the award?
Of all the books we've chosen, or of this year's
No,
short
we're going to get to this year's. You've got a short list of 6 books, but is there a book that somehow captures the spirit? Who won it the first year?
Well, that was Tom Friedman with The World is Flat. Arguably a book that hasn't so much stood the test of time, although he would argue it has.
He would, wouldn't he?
Yeah, I think, you know, in some respects that did capture the spirit of the moment, globalization, and it was a good book to be the initial winner because it kind of summed up the global ambition of the prize to some degree. But I think if there was a winner that summed up the prize, it would probably be, well, I'll pick one of my favourites, although it's not typical of the prize, and that would be Janesville by Amy Goldstein, former Washington Post reporter who wrote about the Wisconsin town that had been left behind by the GM assembly plant moving out. That was, for me, a great winner because it was both a great piece of reportage, a really topical moment in economic and business history, and it was a bit unusual. It stretched the boundaries of what you might consider to be a business book. So that's one of my favourites.
Although, Andrew, I think one of the reasons I like this prize is because, for me, as somebody who talks to a lot of authors, it somehow captures the zeitgeist. So the fact that Friedman got it the first time around for one of his globalization bestsellers, The World is Flat, suggests that the zeitgeist has changed dramatically, hasn't it? I wonder what, I mean, obviously Friedman wouldn't write the same book again, although some of his critics might suggest all his books are basically the same. Those kind of books don't exist anymore. Those, some people might even say utopian, globalizing books.
Yeah, that's probably true. We have a category, if you like, when we're sort of filtering the books for globalization, and that we haven't had many in that category latterly. I think we've seen, obviously, a wave of books in the middle of the book award period which related to the financial crisis. That generated a number of books, not always winners, but you know, classic books like Too Big to Fail. Andrew Ross Sorkin's book was on the shortlist the year after that came out. And latterly, technology has been a big driver. We have, to the global point, we have had some decent China books, although it's becoming increasingly difficult now to find a China book written from within China that kind of makes the grade. We had a book about Tencent last year. And books that take the sort of big sweep, as you say, probably fewer and further between. Chip Wars, which won a couple of years ago, Chris Miller's book, that summed up a little bit of the US-China battle for economic and industrial supremacy. But yeah, big sweep on globalization, probably not so much.
And as you say, we've run the gamut on tech. I remember in the early days, you used to pick a lot of the I'm not sure if Chris Anderson's The Long Tail, but those kind of books would have been on your shortlist that promised salvation with digital, democratization, egalitarianism and all the rest of it. And of course recently the zeitgeist has been turned on its head, and now most of the books written about digital suggests the reverse. So what about 2024, Andrew? Is there, I mean, we're going to get to the individual books in a minute, but we're at the FT, who does a great job dealing with the opportunities and tensions, structural and otherwise, with the global economy. Is there a core theme this year, do you think?
That's a bit hard to detect. I mean, in the wider long list, we had a couple of books on AI, one of which has made the short list. And obviously technology, as I've mentioned, is a big running theme of recent years. To some degree, technology has sort of dominated the winner list over the recent years. Economics, I mean, the challenge to economics is a theme, I think, kind of an alternative view of what are the big challenges economically, emerged a little bit from the short list certainly, and the wider long list. We've had a number of books in the last couple of years that have gone to the big questions of climate emergency, critical minerals. I mentioned Chip War by Chris Miller from a couple of years ago, which arguably is a sort of book looking at the user end of the minerals battle. So natural resources, the environment, those are themes that have come through in the last couple of years and in this selection.
Not surprising, although some people might say, well, why would the FT be doing climate stuff? It's the pink newspaper of business rather than an anti-business. Is there a lot of politics in this, Andrew? Do some people, the people who put together the long list and the short list, do you think in part there are political issues about how they feel about global warming? Ultimately, much of this does boil down to politics, doesn't it? Although, of course, a book with the right message which is badly written isn't necessarily a good book.
No, I mean, I suppose what I'd say is if you're thinking, does politics come into the selection process? I mean, all the judges and indeed the filterers who I coordinate for the long list, in the selection of the long list, are going to be influenced by current trends, and that's the nature of the prize, and indeed it's sort of built into the criteria. But what we're really after, as the criteria say, are the most compelling and enjoyable books which provide business insights. So I would say, politically, if you want to put it that way, it's been important in recent years for business people, business readers or readers of business books to understand some of those issues, be that climate change, environment, the race for critical minerals, to some degree, diversity and equality, although that's not crept into the shortlists that much in recent years. I think those are issues that they've had to understand, and so when it comes down to the filtering and then to the judging panel who select the shortlist, they're thinking, what are the readers, the busy business people who would be our readers, going to want to have from this selection. And that was a driving force behind the prize right at the outset. How can we curate a list for busy people? They could read all 15 or 16 of the long list, or if they're really busy, 6 of the short list, or if they're super busy, here's the one that you're going to have to read this year.
Well, if we had music on the show, Andrew, we would have some drums now, because we're going to get to those books. Let's begin. A number of them have been written by people who have either been on the show or actually I'd like to have on the show, and I think we're going to try and cover all the books before December when the winner is announced. The first book that's really interesting to me is actually by Daniel Susskind. He's been on the show a couple of times before, and it's called Growth, The Reckoning. We've had a number of the quote-unquote degrowth crowd on the show. A lot of people who argue that the only way to, so to speak, grow human beings is by challenging capitalism. Tim Jackson, for example, I'm sure you're familiar with his work. What does Susskind say? Does he come out in Growth, A Reckoning as an anti-capitalist, even someone who might be banned from the FT?
No, far from it. I mean, he is actually taking issue in part with the degrowthers in this book. What he's weighing up is the classic dilemma that growth is good. It lifts people out of poverty. In the last 200 years, it's been the major motor of increases in prosperity. But at the same time, and particularly, I guess, in the post-war period, even in the post-Cold War period, it's been associated with increases in inequality, environmental despoiling of the environment, and other bad stuff. And how can you find a way between that? And he very clearly states that degrowth isn't the answer to that, but at the same time he doesn't believe that full-on pursuit of growth is entirely right either. So he's trying to map a route between those two, and in that sense it's very much I think an FT book, because it's taking a really deep analysis to the question of, you know, how we do economics, how do we get obsessed with GDP as the only measure of what we think is important.
What I like about what you guys have done with the FT, Andrew, is you've made it entertaining, you've tried to make it relevant, and you haven't always swerved away from the politics. I always think now that the paper being in some ways the conscience, if you like, of left liberalism globally. What does Susskind though conclude? I mean, what you just said, we could have said without a book.
Right.
Is he suggesting that the degrowthers are lunatics, that we shouldn't take them seriously, people like Tim Jackson? Is he saying there's a new way of thinking about growth which won't wreck the environment?
He's trying to work his way towards that. I don't think he says at any point that the degrowthers are mad. He is essentially taking he's saying their concerns are legitimate. In fact, those are his concerns as well, that at one extreme, pushed to its extreme, growth can be bad for certain people. But he's also saying that it's a counsel of despair to say that all you can do is to kind of clamp down on growth in order to get through this. What he concludes is it's actually about innovation. It's a way of harnessing human ingenuity that is the most positive outcome, or the most positive objective that one can have, and growth comes as a consequence of that, and good growth from thinking through the way in which you can find ingenious solutions for some of the other problems that it throws up because of the trade-offs that are necessary.
Does he have any models? I hope he doesn't bring up Denmark. Denmark always seems to come up at the end of these books where no one can come to a complete conclusion. They always say, well, we can learn from the Danes or the Swedes or the Norwegians.
Yeah, I don't remember,
or even
to be
the
honest.
Finns,
don't remember, to be honest, whether he goes into the Nordics, as many people do. But it's a high level analysis, which, you know, it's very well written. He's been on our long list before for his book about the future of work. So I think a worthy shortlister.
Yeah, and he's from a very distinguished family. You mentioned AI. I'm actually surprised there's only one AI book. Everyone I know these days seems to be writing a book on AI. This is a book by Pammy Olson, Supremacy, AI, ChatGPT, and the Race That Will Change the World. Terrible subtitle, but I hope the book's better than that.
The book's great. It's a reported book. She's a Bloomberg columnist and has been looking at and takes a wider book-length view of the race initially between Demis Hassabis of Google DeepMind and Sam Altman of OpenAI, who she
personalizes it.
Yeah, but she paints that as essentially two geniuses coming from different directions to the conclusion that AI has the ability to make the world a better place and improve the world. And I mean, I'm bowdlerizing a bit the thesis here, but they become, if you like, the captured by Google and Microsoft respectively, and it becomes a commercial race, which she concludes is a bad thing, and potentially leads to the sort of over-domination of the new technology by two big technology companies. And when I put this to her on a webinar that we did linked to the book award, others on the webinar pointed out, obviously there are other options available from Google and Microsoft, but her book is very squarely about what has happened as DeepMind has become folded into Google and OpenAI has come under the control essentially of Microsoft.
That's a really radical thesis in the sense of OpenAI coming under the control of Microsoft. I'm not sure everyone I know, at least in tech, would agree with that. There's also an intriguing idea of comparing Hassabis of Google, originally one of the founders of DeepMind, and Altman. Altman is, I don't know how you would describe it, perhaps he's Elon Musk. He's a little bit more of a palatable version of Elon Musk, whereas Hassabis is always, when anyone wants to cite a responsible technologist who people trust, they bring up Hassabis. I don't know the book, but I'll look forward to reading it. It's an interesting thesis. We had the third book on the list, The Longevity Imperative, Building a Better Society for Healthier, Longer Lives by Andrew Scott, who I know teaches at London Business School. He's also a big Spurs fan, so he's a friend of mine. We've had him on the show talking about the longevity imperative. Why did you choose this book?
So the judges, I think, felt that this was a book that highlighted an aspect of the demographic challenge that clearly is one of the things that is on the minds of business people and business readers. Andrew Scott, as you know, was co-author of The 100-Year Life, which was on our shortlist a few years ago with Linda Grattan, another London Business School professor. And here he's taken that thesis from The 100-Year Life and added to it and expanded it and brought it up to date and pushed out a more precise agenda, if you like, for government policymakers, businesses and individuals about how we deal with the fact that we are all living longer, what he calls an evergreen agenda. And I think this appealed to the judges in part because it's a way of looking at the world that tends to get ignored. And indeed, part of Scott's book is about how we put a lot of effort into responding to the pandemic, or going for literal moonshots, or trying to change the world in other ways, but we haven't paid attention to how we make our longer lives healthier and better. And he pushes out pushes at the policymakers to do more about this and to start now, because we're already at a stage where in countries like the US and the UK, we're heading towards a sort of shortgevity problem as the longevity of recent years begins to be kind of edged away by deaths of despair and other issues.
Did Angus Deaton, by the way, did Deaths of Despair? I assume that won.
That was on the shortlist, and Anne Case and Angus Deaton. I can't remember who won in that year, but
I'm struck with Scott. He was annoyingly youthful, and I wonder. I thought you were going to say that it intrigued the jury because they're all old too. Is there a generational quality here? No books about young people.
Yeah, good point. I mean, we have had a lot of books on technology recently, some of them written by very young authors like Sarah Fryer's book about Netflix, which won a couple of years ago. So I don't think we're in danger of just giving the prize to older authors. But yeah, I would say the judges shade older, let's be fair.
In all seriousness, Andrew, I mean, I don't know what the demographics are of the FT readership, but I'm guessing your sweet spot is someone in their 50s, even God forbid their 60s. I mean, this is a mature paper for a mature audience, and this is a mature book award too.
That's true. It's always good to find new audiences. I mean, we're always trying to pick at the younger audience.
Everyone always shows up in their 50s and 60s, Andrew, unless something awful happens to them.
Yeah, true. But this is a book that I think has a message for that younger generation as well, just as Linda Grattan and Andrew Scott's previous book did, because it's essentially saying the people who are going to live to 100 years are the ones who have been born in the last 10 or 15 years, so they are the ones who need to start planning ahead for their personal career objectives, and that's something Scott covers as well.
Yeah, and I think Scott brings much more coherence and a more substantial socio-political and cultural analysis of living longer than the typical books written in Silicon Valley, of the Kurzweilian books about living forever, which ignore those. So how do you qualify for the prize? Are some books just not businessy enough? I remember one of my books, one of your judges wanted to put on, and then they told me afterwards, well, they didn't consider it to be a book about business, because the book, which I've got Michael Morris actually coming on the show in the next couple of weeks, Tribal, how the cultural instincts that divide us can help us bring us together. I mean, obviously with the US election coming up, this is an issue, a message that obsesses everyone, but it doesn't sound very businessy or economicsy.
Well, that is a consideration, and you ask how books get qualified, and I have to put my hand up to, in case you're going to ask this later anyway, about any big misses. The biggest miss that I can identify, and it's entirely on me, was that we didn't choose Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman when it came out. Didn't even make the long list.
That, Andrew, sorry to interrupt, but that may actually prove his point about behavioral economics.
It could well do, but I'm guilty of having read it in manuscript form because it was coming out towards the second half of the year that we considered and hadn't yet been published, and thought of it as not being a business book, and yet it's been cited in virtually every, certainly every behavioral economics book and many other business books that have been on our long list since. So it's a bit dangerous to dismiss that. I think Tribal, Michael Morris's book, which is also one that's been selected, as it were, sight unseen, because it's not published yet and came to us in the sort of proof form, is a book about business and management and the behaviour of teams, and he is very careful to use examples across the whole range from politics. Lee Kuan Yew gets a mention for what he's done in Singapore, but also the business elements of the book, which some of our judges actually pointed out when we were selecting the shortlist, that this was a book that they'd wished they'd had when they were a CEO or when they were managing a big team, because it's essentially about how we work in teams, how to harness that for positive benefits rather than defaulting to what we generally consider to be the problem with tribalism, which is that we're divided into warring tribes or feuding groups. And his point, very forcefully made with lots and lots of examples, is, in fact, this is a innate human trait that can be used for benefit if we know how to go about making our teams work better together.
I take your point, although, again, judging from the big tech companies, I know companies like Google, where my wife works, they all share the same values. You don't have the same tribalism within a Google or even a big industrial company like GM, I'm guessing, or one of the banks that you would find in America, this Trump-Harris division, or this division between Make America Great Again and liberals.
Now that's true, and I mean, obviously some of that might be bad tribalism that will be pretty bad for the future of GM if it was dividing into warring factions. But I think Morris's point is, there are ways in which we can do this positively. He makes a point early on, actually, interestingly, since we're in the FT and it's Friday and not many people are around because there's a lot of working from home.
Put it mildly, Andrew, if we had our cameras on the floor, there would be no one here. I think I'd get everyone fired.
I think you need to go to a different floor. I know that on the editorial floor we're all working away at our desks, but his point is, there's a reason why actually in lots of respects we work better when we're in one place together, and that's because we can tune into other people's instinctive knowledge of what works and what doesn't work, which is much more difficult to do when you're working remotely. That's a sort of small point that he makes near the beginning of the book, but I think lots of lessons there for managers about how to work teams.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm sure someone will come up with a book arguing that it's better to have that. I mean, we all fetishize diversity. You're supposed to have people of different skins and genders and sexualities and all the rest of it. Why shouldn't you have the same when it comes to political views within corporations? Although I think many business analysts might be more ambiguous on that. One book that I'm clearly didn't have a problem qualifying, like the Morris book is by one of the great economic journalists, an FT journalist, John Kay, and it's got a classic business title. I can imagine this book winning. The Corporation in the 21st Century, classic title, but the subtitle's even better. Why almost everything we are told about business is wrong. And isn't that a bit of a contradiction, Andrew, since John Kay is the guy who's told us everything that we know about business? So is he acknowledging that he's been wrong in the past?
Well, John has been quite a contrarian. I mean, just to clarify, he's not employed by the FT because that would make him ineligible for the prize. He was until 4 or 5 years ago. He was an FT columnist, but this is supposedly the first of a trilogy of books that he's producing. And this one, what appealed to me about this book as a former management editor was that he does walk us through, and in fact, he explicitly says at the beginning that this is a book for people who want to know about business, not necessarily for the audience for this prize or the FT people who are already in business. But he takes I think a nicely sort of witty, rather acerbic view of how business is done, laden with examples of things that have gone wrong, scandals, issues within business. He has a good close look at how the corporation evolved, the history of the company as the kind of classic capitalist channel for doing business. And then he sort of pulls that down a bit and says, in a world of digital and services where everything is dematerialized, the company is not necessarily fit for purpose. And how are we going to how is the corporation going to deal with this new world? I think he and his publishers point to this being a book about the future of the corporation, but our reviewer Philip Auger took issue with that a bit and said actually there's not much in there about the future of the company, but there's a lot about how we got to where we are, and possibly in other books in the trilogy we're going to learn a bit more about what comes next.
Of course, corporations dominated the 20th century. Lots of utopian thinking about the future of organizations in Silicon Valley.
Sure.
DAOs, distributed autonomous organizations. The whole Web3 movement is founded on decentralized organizations. So he doesn't really touch on that in the book.
No, I think you could count him probably a skeptic on those sorts of ideas, as I am.
Utopian thinking.
But in this one, it's more about how we got to where we are. And as I say, it's a really good. I hesitate to call it a primer because it's obviously deeply researched, and it's based on a lifetime of experience that John Kay's had writing and thinking about the economics of business and capitalism in general. But as for somebody who was starting out and wanting to understand how we got here, I think this would be a good recommendation.
Well, the one thing that's for sure about the book business, Andrew, again, don't need me to tell you this, is timing is everything. A book that doesn't seem relevant 5 years ago can be incredibly relevant today, and sometimes I've been subjected to this. Sometimes a book comes out too early. I wrote a book in 2011 called Digital Vertigo, which was very critical of social media and of Facebook in general, and it was the least successful of my books. So timing is everything, and the final book seems perfectly timed. It's the book that really stands out in terms of its immediate relevance in late 2024. Especially given what's happening both in Gaza, South Lebanon, and Ukraine. Unit X, how the Pentagon and Silicon Valley are transforming the future of war. Do you agree with me that if of all the books, this is perhaps the one that is timed best?
That one and Tribal, I think, probably, which is explicitly trying to, I think, catch the wave of thinking about the election. But yes, certainly this one, I mean, we wouldn't want to wish wars on anybody, but it does have that sense that it's time to start thinking, how do we deal with modern warfare, and it comes right up to date in terms of referencing both the Ukraine war and the Gaza conflict in the final chapters, and looking at the ways in which US technology, because it's written by the two authors, Raj Shah and Christopher Kirchhoff, who were assigned to run this Unit X, a unit of the Department of Defense that was set up by the Pentagon in order to tap into Silicon Valley ingenuity and technology. And there's a lot in there which I find, again, with my management hat on, very compelling about how they found a way to build, I suppose the word would be workarounds for the usual Department of Defense bureaucracy in order to rush through technological purchases and alliances with startups and entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley to fight wars better. So it is from that point of view, I think, really timely.
Not morally, of course, but more effectively.
Yeah, more, not morally better, but certainly more effectively, at least as they paint it. And it's they're no longer at Unit X, so they also have a strong critique of the way in which the West, and obviously specifically in this case the US, has not taken advantage of a lot of the ingenuity that's out there. And in the end of the book, they go to Ukraine and they refer to some of the incredible kind of on the hoof adaptations that the Ukrainians have made to equip their military, and contrast that with, for example, high-spec drones that were shot down in the first couple of minutes that came from the Department of Defense and the US arsenal, but proved to be less effective than the cheaper workarounds that the Ukrainians were building.
Of course, we're talking in the aftermath of the Israeli operation to put explosives in many handheld devices in Lebanon, quite an achievement done by a state, that the startup state. This is a particularly intriguing title, how the Pentagon and Silicon Valley are transforming the future of war. There's been a lot of pieces recently, and we've done a number of shows on the way in which, in some ways, some people believe at least, and they're worried about it, that Silicon Valley might actually be replacing the Pentagon, that US foreign policy, or not US foreign policy, but foreign policy generally, is being made by men like Elon Musk through their various technological companies, initiatives, particularly in Ukraine. You touched on this earlier. Is this relationship between Pentagon and Silicon Valley, does it come out intact from this book?
I think that if you have to aim off a little bit for the fact that they're leading the charge, almost literally in the middle of the book, and demonstrating how, with the help of a sympathetic defense secretary and the right people in the right places, they were able to turn the kind of Pentagon's power to better effect and link up with Silicon Valley. And towards the end of the book, with a new defense secretary and different personnel, things get a bit stickier and they're a bit more critical. So I think one of the things I like about it is that it does illustrate this kind of push me, pull you relationship, and into that you also have to throw, as you mentioned, the kind of the moral questions that have prevented many in Silicon Valley from wanting to get involved with the defense establishment. But of course, as they reference, everything from DARPA to more recent robotics advances and so on has, in the long history of Silicon Valley, the funding and the impetus and the policy that drives a lot of initiatives in Silicon Valley has often come from the Washington and the Pentagon. So there's an interesting sort of historical backdrop to this, which I think is thrown into great relief by the fact that we are now seeing modern wars being carried out on various fronts. And of course, we should mention as well, and they do, the preparation for taking on China if that came to pass.
I was going to bring up there are books in this. Maybe next year and the year after there'll be a book on this, particularly on your shortlist. How does Silicon Valley come out of this? One has always thought of it, so to speak, as being a gun for hire. Guys like Peter Thiel funded major military startups, technological military startups, Palantir, for example, which was also, I think, funded by the CIA. And I think there's an ambivalence on the part of right-wing Silicon Valley people like Peter Thiel between supporting the West in their fights against authoritarian China and making a lot of money.
Yeah, I don't recall off the top of my head whether they tackle the Peter Thiel question itself, but what they essentially are trying to do in the book, or what they're trying to do when they take on Unit X, is to pivot the first version, which was ignored by Silicon Valley, to one that will attract the right technology and the right entrepreneurs. So they spend quite a lot of time describing how they made it attractive to the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. Obviously, money talks to some extent here, but also the way in which they were working, and spent quite some time educating Pentagon officials about what was necessary in order to attract. And they don't seem to have had any particular problems with finding a receptive audience in Silicon Valley for working in that way. And I think there's an interesting evolution even during the book, and which we've seen in the wider world, which is that sense of the importance of defence thrown into a strong, underlined of course by the fact that wars are being fought, and that the threat, whether China or Russia, appears to be greater, that might have driven obviously some of the thinking, some of the ways in which they're able to sell themselves. It's an interesting book about Silicon Valley, as much as it is an interesting book about US defence, I think.
You use the P word, Andrew, pivot, but that, in my view, at least horrible 5-letter word that's overused in Silicon Valley. I'm pleased, I don't think any of the books have pivot in them, do they? In the title, certainly not in the title.
Not in the title, no. I tend to agree with you, sorry for allowing the jargon to slip in there, but we haven't got any pivoting going on.
Good, well, I don't know what the new word is. I would also be intrigued by John Kay's take on this increasingly autonomous, not just arms industry. I mean, the old Eisenhower's old military-industrial complex is being replaced by something else. It's enormously important.
Yeah, it is important, and also I think potentially, as you suggested, I mean, I think there are dangers there. I mean, clearly there's a...
To put it mildly.
Yeah, to put it mildly, and that's where I think the kind of this Unit X description of the way in which a bureaucracy that is built for obviously life and death situations, and making sure that the performance can be optimal in those situations, versus a fast charging, move fast and break things culture that may prevail in some parts of Silicon Valley still. How do you make those two work in tandem? And indeed, how do you avoid, as you suggested, the kind of over-dominance of particular personalities who've not always been sympathetic to the idea that the government knows best?
Well, I'm wearing my heart on the sleeve. It's clear that I'm particularly intrigued. I haven't read it yet, but I'm eager to get my hands on the book and get Shah and Kirchhoff on the book. The only warning for me on this one, in contrast with the other 5, is it's written by 2 people. I'm always wary of co-authored books. It's like a car designed by committee. It always turns out to be pretty awful. Do you think that books written by 2 people, or God forbid 3, are often a bit cobbled together and a bit garbled and lacking personality?
I think that can happen. My worst nightmare are books written by groups of consultants, which are often I used to call them, the heaviest business card ever created, because they're really built or written to be handed out at conferences. But I don't think it's a general rule. Poor Economics by Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo won the award a few years ago. Great book. They're of course married, so perhaps they have a more harmonious way of being able to write than some other co-authors do. But yeah, you're right, it's a little bit of a rarity to have co-authors going all the way in this award.
And then the committee quality, or lack of quality, is also reflected in the award itself. You don't decide it, you put a group of people together. It must be one of the more challenging aspects of this, Andrew, getting them all in the same room and getting them to agree on anything.
Yeah, we do this virtually now, which is a shame, because we used to actually have them in the room, most of them in person. and we did the judging of the shortlist on the day the shortlist was announced, and the judging of the award winner on the day of the award. Now there's a slight lag in order to get people from different continents, so it's a slightly more sterile process than it used to be. But this is a group, some of whom have been on the panel for a long time, some are new. This year, Sherry Kutu, the entrepreneur and tech expert, is a new judge this year, and the chemistry is pretty good actually. And what I like as essentially an observer when it gets to this stage is to see people who obviously often have powerful jobs in business, whether that's editor of the FT, Rula Khalaf, who chairs the panel, or somebody like Shruti Vadera, who's the chair of Prudential in the UK. Putting their attention to something that is not exactly trivial, but certainly not a big business decision, and applying some of the same methods of sort of horse trading and discussion and negotiation that they do, presumably when they're in another meeting. So it's great to observe, and I think although it's mostly by consensus, it doesn't shy away, that group, from taking issue with each other on their choices. And there were some pretty robust discussions to come to this shortlist this year, I can tell you.
Robust meaning people screaming at one another?
Not quite screaming, but I mean there were some strongly held views that needed to be worked through, and the eventual 6 is always a consensus and the winner. But we had some close run things in previous years.
Yeah, the list is lacking the traditional heavyweights. There's no Gladwell, no Thomas Friedman. Do you sometimes shy away from the more popular writers?
I don't think so. I think you can see from previous years. Last year we had Walter Isaacson's book on Elon Musk on the shortlist. If I'm going to say personally, I prefer it when we don't have big heavyweight authors on there. I think it makes for a more interesting list to some degree, because there's less second guessing of who the winner might be. And I like the idea that the prize can sometimes bring through names that we haven't necessarily seen before, occasional first-time authors, people whose books have only recently come out. These are, that's a good list, I think, this year, and one which makes it hard for anyone, even me, who was privy to the shortlist discussion, to know who's actually going to win.
Well, I got it completely wrong last year, Andrew. I had no,
who did you go with last year? I can't remember.
I know who I didn't go with. Who was the winner?
The winner was Amy Edmondson's book, The Right Kind of Red.
I would have put her at the bottom, although she was a delightful interviewer. But I was really surprised with that one. So my opinion is worthless, but I'm going with 2 instinctively. The first is Unit X, because I think it's a really important subject, very, very timely given the tragic wars going on at the moment, and it's certainly not something that's going away, about the Pentagon and Silicon Valley. And the other one that I could see coming through, I don't know if it's a dark horse, but one that fits the classic FT image is the Susskind book on growth. It's a very important issue. So in broad intellectual terms, I'm going with Susskind. For immediacy, for timing, I'm going with the Shah Kirchhoff book, Unit X, but I'm sure I'll be wrong. And of course, you're not allowed to even hint at which ones you think.
No, all I'd say is often I'm surprised. I can usually think after the shortlist discussion, which has obviously already happened, a couple of months go by, the judges usually reread all 6. In some cases, some of the 6 will be ones that they didn't like for the shortlist in the first place, and then also things happen. News happens, sometimes opinions shift, and sometimes you can get a surprise winner comes through in the final discussion ahead of the December 9th announcement of the award winner.
So we've got to wait till December 9th, Andrew. What are we going to do in the meantime? I guess there'll be an election to keep us occupied.
Yeah, that's true. We'll be able to think about
Will
that.
that shape it in any way? Do you come to the decision before the election?
No, it takes place after the election. There was a book on the long list, Lucky Loser, which has just come out, about Trump and his finances. Straight down the line business book about Trump by the New York Times journalists who wrote that award-winning series about his finances, but didn't make it onto the final list. And obviously, if that had been there, that might have well had a bearing on how well it was going to be thought of when it came to the post-election discussion of the winner.
Well, Andrew Hill, the man who puts together, makes the trains run on time when it comes to the FT Book of the Year. Congratulations on the short list. 6 fascinating books. I'm going to get all of them on the show. Some of them I've had before, like Andrew Scott. We'll get him back. And we will be very intrigued by who turns out the winner in early December. So Andrew Hill of the FT, thank you so much.
Thank you, pleasure to be here.